Hey, Al.
Man, how you doing?
Good.
See you. Well, here we go. I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Friday, we have the Healing Circle, and pleased to be here and pleased to have you along. Those who are listening on Facebook or YouTube, we broadcast this or webcast it through both the McFarlane Media Facebook social media pages, Insight, and YouTube on locally here, but also through the Facebook page and YouTube channel of Black Press USA. Also glad to see Harvey Linder. We had a great conversation 2 weeks ago, and I'm glad to see both of you back again. How are you gentlemen doing? Good afternoon. Dr. Oliver and Dr. Linder.
Hello, Al. Hello, Harvey.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm
Good
good.
to see you again, Oliver.
You too.
I don't
I,
know. I don't know if Al is glad to see me again.
I am really glad to see you. I wanted to continue that conversation. That's why I'm glad you're here, because I think we're on the right track by talking about what I remember, Harvey, was me making reference to Ma'afa,
hmm
and that is a certain way of looking at understanding of knowing
uh-huh.
about the history of the contact between the modern contact between Africa and Europe. And it has to do with a description of what you call the Holocaust, the
Uh-huh.
experience of horrific uh, uh, destruction of our civilizations by European imperialism, colonialism, and the transatlantic slave trade. That all started, 1300, 1400, 1500 to present day.
Uh-huh.
You said we can't focus on that alone. And I totally agree. And you
Uh-huh.
said instead, we need to look at ancient African ways of knowing, and you referred to Ma'at.
Right.
And I thought that was a putting a toe in the water. And what I wanted was to go deep, because I'm totally in agreement with you that
hmm
there is a place of knowing and a way of knowing that precedes our experience in this hemisphere and in modern time, but that exists in a way that
hmm
we have either been hidden from it or it's been hidden from us. And we simply have to rediscover it. And part of the rediscovery process is a indwelling intuition, but it's also training. It's
hmm
also developing the language, the techniques, and the practices that will put us in connection with that which we have lost in terms of specific knowledge and ways of knowing that come out of us and that also center us as the creators of life on this planet. And
hmm
so, I'd love to start right there and have you talk more about that. And Dr. Williams, jump in where you want to. I know Dr. B should be here. And one of the things we had in mind was
Well, I talked to
talking.
Dr. B this morning, and she wasn't feeling well,
Right.
So
and
she
so
might not be
she's
with us.
yeah.
Well, listen, let's do this. And this is always unscripted. It's a
hmm
conversation, and we can take it wherever we want to. I'm interested in continuing the conversation we had, and if you're comfortable
hmm
with that, Harvey and Oliver, I'd say let's have at it.
Well, if Oliver will permit me for a
Yeah,
couple of minutes here,
absolutely.
uh, y- you know, I spout off a lot of ideas, but the reality is that, um, you know, I say it in a way that people begin to think of me as an expert or thought leader in that area, and I'm really not. I'm a student. I'm learning a lot of these notions, a lot of these ideas, which I think is needs to be true of all of us. We all need to begin to see ourselves as perpetual students.
Right.
But a lot of the ideas that I have and that I try to share with people, I got from one of your recent guests, Morlana Karinga. It was Karinga's work on Ma'at that led to the development of my ideas, and he talks about um, his learning about Ma'at and how that led to his development of the Kwanzaa principles and the development of the idea that we can create our own. Not only can we create our own holidays, but we can create our own futures. And it was the beginning of that kind of thought process, that by looking back looking back isn't just about looking back. Looking back is about creating the future. So that's the lead in for what I wanted to say about this conversation. I would love to think I'm uh, astute enough, knowledgeable enough to present myself as some kind of expert, but I'm really not. But but you have people like Dr. Williams here, and Dr. Karinga, who really are experts in this field.
Well, let's talk about the field. I mean, I think it's an important conversation. It's one that we don't have enough, but it's one that we can put it back into popular, dialogue, popular usage if we intend to do it. And if we decide to do it, I mean, I think that this kind of conversation ought to be at the dinner table in everyone's home all the time. I think that this kind of conversation ought to be the conversation we have on the street corner, in the barbershop, in church, chit-chatting on social media, talking about how do you view the world and view us in it in a way that celebrates our dignity, our humanity, that acknowledges our future. And in doing so, as you just described, Dr. Harvey, suggests and points us toward it looks at our past, but it points us towards a future that we are creating as we speak that honors that past. And I think the most instructive thing out of our last conversation was for us to say, don't get caught up and stuck in the bumps on the road. Right. Don't get stuck in Jim Crow.
Yes.
Don't get stuck in slavery.
Right.
Don't get stuck in Ma'afa. There's something beyond that.
Don't ignore it.
Yeah.
It is part of our reality that we need to deal with, but we need to be able to, my point is that we need to be able to transcend it at some point. Yep. We need to be able to go beyond being stuck in the past.
So the question becomes, Dr. Oliver Williams, what is transcendence? What is transcendence? And transcendence to what end? What is the point?
Yeah. Well, the thing I was thinking about was when I've seen people look at our experience in the United States and blame us for our experience. So I remember working with some young men, and they were arrested by a group of policemen. And so when the policemen started asking them questions about being African American, and so the only thing that the young men could say was the reason why it seems like they're getting arrested or they're involved in bad things is because of the culture, when they had no knowledge of the culture really at all. And so they attributed it to bad things that had happened to them in their life. And then on top of that, started to blame themselves for negative things that they were involved in, and then called it the culture. And so the question that I had, not only for the people that were asking the question, but because there were other groups of police officers there, asked them how much they knew about African American culture. And then the other thing is to not let people who were involved in continuous negative behavior be the ones that defined what the culture was.
Right.
Because and I asked them about their experiences and where they interacted with people and how did they know African Americans. Had they been to, so Dance Theater Harlem is coming to Northrop Auditorium tonight, or Alvin Ailey, has been involved in performing, or the Sounds of Blackness, or any number of things that we could look at as not only performers, but also people who were contributors. Listening to Donald Trump talk about things, you would get the impression that Black people didn't do anything. It was only white people that created stuff. And it's clear that he doesn't know anything. And so the thing is that, one has to have experience in the culture, but to go to places to to and be connected with places that have created positive outcomes for African Americans,
Mhm.
and let that help define the culture only, not the negative things, and
Um,
not to
um,
blame us for our the problems that we've had by people who've been persecuting us for years and years and
Interestingly, a lot of the negative things that are identified as negative aspects of Black culture are not even artifacts of Black culture at all.
years.
They
Right. That's right.
they are vestiges. They're cultural. They have cultural origins, but they're not African cultural origins.
That's right.
They're European cultural origins that we have been acculturated into, and
Hmm.
have adopted, and they're things that are optimized for a different culture than ours, and so they don't work as well for us. And
Right.
um, they're seen as as cultural artifacts, which they are, but again, they're not African cultural artifacts.
Right.
Are you familiar with this book? And this is I was trying to I went off camera to grab this out of the stack without making the stack fall. But this is one of the, and I haven't read it yet. I'm reading it. It's
Hmm.
been being read, and I've never gotten all the way through it. But it's called the Metu Neter, I think it's
Hmm.
pronounced. But this is where I have become acquainted with the concept of Ma'at.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, this is a guidebook about ancient African civilization.
Hmm.
And are you either familiar with this? Are you
I'm
familiar?
not familiar with that book,
Okay.
but
Okay.
metanetter is a term that refers to um, loosely refers to the writings of the gods.
Hmm.
It's kind of an inappropriate reference, but that's the way it's been translated. But really, it's the language of the knowledge and principles
Hmm.
of the past. When the Europeans came to Africa to study African history, they encountered these principles that were embodied in what we refer to as the netters, and the only equivalent that the closest equivalent they could think of for what the netters represented were the things that they attributed to gods in Greece
Hmm.
and in Western culture, and so they described these Kemetic principles as gods, and
Hmm.
so they say Egyptians had like this whole pantheon of gods, but the reality is that it's an inappropriate reference. The reference really is to the foundational principles of the universe, and so they have icons that are there to represent um, those foundational principles. And so, like the one that we were talking about early, principle of Ma'at. The principle of Ma'at is is simply the notion that the universe is not chaotic. The universe is not random. The universe has order. The universe has things happen in a repeatable and predictable order that that they were able to see in nature. Just by observing nature, you can see that things don't just happen haphazardly. There's a systematic order to how things happen. So there's this principle of order that has an icon that is used to signify that order, and that principle was referred to as ma'at. And so they have like a figure that they use to depict ma'at,
Hmm.
and sometimes it's the goddess figure, and sometimes it's uh, well, this thing comes out of a whole sort of uh, we know about these things because they were written on the tombs and they were written in the funerary writings. And so one of the images that comes back from the tomb writings is the image of judgment at, at the end of death. And the idea is that if you've led a good life, um, you'll be lighthearted. And if you've led a not so good life, then you'll be heavy hearted. That's where we get those terms, lighthearted and heavy hearted. but the image in the funerary scrolls was like a scale,
Mm-hmm.
and on one end of the scale, the heart of the departed is placed on one side of the scale, and on the other end of the scale, a feather is placed.
Mm-hmm.
And if you led a good life, the scales should balance. You should be able to. Should be so lighthearted that your deeds and your legacy would be so lighthearted that you would balance with a feather. And if not, there was this animal that came and gobbled up your heart, and you didn't survive in
Hence the
eternity.
term "light as a feather,"
Right.
right?
But we have these these images that were passed down. One was the image of Ma'at, who, in some of the images, Ma'at was the goddess who was holding the scale. In some of the images, Ma'at is standing off to the side, observing this. And sometimes Ma'at is depicted as the goddess, and sometimes Ma'at is depicted as the scale, and sometimes Ma'at is symbolized just by the feather itself.
I'm
But
looking
yeah.
at the contents, and the contents guide me actually through what you're just saying, Harvey. On chapter 18, it talks about the Metutu, and the description of the chapter is the philosophical and psychological foundation of the Metu Netter. Is it Netter? That's how it reads, but
Netter.
I think I've heard it pronounced Netcher.
Well,
Or
the
Oracle
plural
system.
is actually Neteru.
Netteru, right? Okay. And
Netter is singular, plural is Neteru.
it goes on to say the system shaping the factors of success and the shaping factors of failure. And the last line in there is a chapter or a page on a place and time for all things. That's chapter 18. That leads to the description of the Metutu. It's called, and this is the list to each of those principles you talk of. I think Amun, Aser, Tehuti, Seker, Ma'at, Herukuti, Heru, Het Heru, Sebek, Osset, Geb, Sheps, and Dark Deceased, Nekebet, and Uwachet. So those are the netters, I guess.
Yes, those are the
Yeah.
netters, and all those netters were the embodiment of some principle.
Principles.
And we have concepts like that in Western culture. We just don't think of them that way. But we have, for example, a principle that we call liberty, and we have an icon that we recognize to symbolize liberty. We call it the Statue of Liberty. There's a famous French painting of the liberty leading the people. But liberty is not a real person, and liberty is not a god. Liberty is a symbol, of a principle, something we believe in. And so it was similar to that, that you had these figures, deified figures that were there to represent the incorporation to symbolize a principle in nature.
So Oliver, is one of the pathways to self-realization for individuals and for the culture, the capacity, a strategy, a protocol that places us back in language that in and of itself guides one to think and act out of the principles. Is there a process, a system that we can develop or should develop that has us use language that is principled, but is about the principle, that evokes and reflects the principles, that connect us to a sense of both the origin and a sense of our authentic connection to creation itself, and in doing so enables us to navigate our mundane day to day with a different confidence, a confidence that reflects knowledge, awareness, and affinity, connectedness to other human beings, connectedness to the environment and to all of creation. Is that a place where we can go, should go? What do you think, Oliver Williams?
I think it is. And I think that, different philosophies have influenced, for me, some of it has to do with Christianity. But then I also think of Islam. and principles that exist in Islam. And I know that Mother Toon, promotes Kemetic teaching in the work that she does. And I think that a way to be able to guide us, but also ways to be able to look at, philosophies of communities that we've come from influences some of those things as well. You know, going to different countries, you start to reflect on things that they, have looked at in a positive way that defines the culture that they've come from. And that's kind of influential, in the sense that you see some of the positive things that have come from that. They can come from that. I guess negative things too, but positive things that can come from that. So I do think that, um, I think, when we look at things, by nature, some people may look at nature, generally speaking, as something that can have a positive effect on people. But sometimes, when we look at different acts that people have adhered to, sometimes it can be negative as well. But if we looked at some of the positive things that we get from that, generally speaking, is do we believe that people are good? Do we believe that there is a way of knowing God as a consequence of reflecting over our life, that there's something bigger than us? The fact that we have to learn how to be able to not struggle with our own limitations, but give it to a higher power. I think those ideas have helped to heal people when we look at substance abuse or mental health, struggles that people have in their daily lives. Reflecting over those things can be useful. But again, I think some of it has to deal with people being taught, those things. And I think if you have a way of being taught some of those ideas, those principles, it can have a positive impact on one's life. I think of people who, have traditions given, the cultures that they've come from. That can be, quite positive in terms of how they look at themselves, they look at their family, and they look at their community. And then what they have a responsibility of doing in terms of engaging those different elements, but contributing to those different elements, because that, one is defined by those things. So yeah, I think that reflecting over those things, but also things that we're engaged with learning and being taught can be a positive thing.
And so, how do we do it? How do we make it happen? How do we infuse both the learning process, the awareness of learning, so that it becomes less? I think right now we move in a way it's appropriate. The expectation that our job as parents is to get our 4-year-old or 3-year-old into daycare and this kind of responsible training preschool mode, and then get them to or through kindergarten and elementary. And I think as a group, too many of us simply hand our children over, and we're not directly involved in the support and the direction of the learning experience that the child has. And too many of us don't have a family personal strategy for supplementing, for buttressing that which is consumed by the child in curriculum and in experience in school with principles. I think we often refer to that our Jewish brothers have Saturday school, and other cultures probably do things after the public school or regular school problem time to infuse and protect the culture, to understand that the homogenized education system does not pay particular attention, and sometimes is dismissive in ways that could be detrimental to the individual learning student. And so the culture organizes a response that supports that child's development of identity through Saturday or through culture or through dance or through community. Sometimes we miss that. I think we miss that too much. My question to both of you is, how do we put ourselves back into a vein of intentionality? What I'm describing, I think, did exist. I think it existed in our families after the end of slavery. I think that there was a huge movement towards education, towards learning, and towards the value of developing the race, the community, coming out of the horrific experience of state-sanctioned slavery in this country. But I think that that has been met with resistance, institutional resistance, cultural resistance, in waves after waves after waves. And part of the cost and the loss associated with that is sometimes we lose focus on, this aspiration and the aspirational nature of the culture, the meaning of the culture. What do you think?
I think that we have this a saying in Afrocentric circles of that all knowledge is self knowledge, and the reality is that we have to begin with the notion that we have to interrogate ourselves. We have to interrogate our own beliefs and values and what we think we know. Because before we can learn anything, we have to learn what it is we have to unlearn in order to free our minds and open our minds to be able to incorporate the things we need to know. One of the problems is that knowledge, the ability to accumulate knowledge, is based on what knowledge is already in there. So if you have a foundation of myths and half truths and just misinformation, and you're trying to build a new foundation, for learning, it's like you're building it on what is that, like building castles on the sand or something like that. You're building something that's ultimately going to fall down. And you have to go back to the basics of what is it what is it that we think we know, and is that really, is there another way to look at the things that we know and think we know? And I think that journey of interrogating yourself and learning yourself begins with learning who you are, learning who you come from, what your culture is, learning that cultural knowledge, and beginning to compare and contrast that to the Western cultural paradigm that we've grown up in, that has taught us a lot of things that just really aren't true. The problem is that the Western paradigm tends to know things by dividing them into, good, bad, right, wrong, up, down, black, white. We the Western paradigm this learns by differentiation, learns by learns to identify something by what is it different than, and that's a different learning paradigm. That's a different knowledge paradigm than the African-centered paradigm, which is you learn not just by knowing what something is different from. You learn by also knowing what it is, what it shares. What is the consubstantiality? What is the common substance there? And it's a thing that we call diunital thinking. It's like diunital thinking is, rather than the dichotomous thinking of either or, you learn that most things in the universe are somehow both and, that there's two sides of everything. Like there's, the Earth has a North Pole and a South Pole, the North Pole isn't better than the South Pole. It's just the other end of the same thing. Uh, Ma'at as a concept has like, it says that, everything has a right order in the universe. But Ma'at itself has a transverse. It has an other side that's called its fet. Disorder is the other end of order. And everything in the universe can be thought of in that way. Dr. Williams talks about, us identifying, um, you know, people as, are they good people? Are they bad people? Well, the reality is that all of us have the capacity to be both or either,
Right. Right.
All people have the capacity to do good. All people have the capacity to do bad things as well. And that's, that it comes with the territory. So we have to learn to think with diunital logic and learn to go back and uh, reassess the knowledge that we've acquired from that conception of what's the other side of this. I'm looking at this one way. Is there another way to look at this? And that's not that one way is better or another, but it's a way of expanding our conceptualization of the universe and how it works and who we are and where we fit into that universe.
Hillary Thomas is monitoring on Facebook and dropped a note in the comment section saying that there seems to be a shift in our understanding. I think he's saying that some people carry very little about the truth, but more about self-interest. What about that? What does it mean when a person is driven by self-interest? Is that a bad thing? And is there a place where self-interest and the truth, whatever the truth is, are in alignment?
If you want to use diunital logic there, then self-interest, is neither good nor bad. I mean, there are times when self-interest will serve you well, and there are times when self-interest will betray you.
For instance,
it's good for African people to be working in our self-interest to make the world a better place. If we get so self-interested that we're only interested in advancing ourselves as individuals, then it doesn't benefit, the race or the culture or the human species as a whole. So self-interest is not a bad thing or a good thing. It can lead, it will lead to alternating the results depending on how you apply it. And that's the other thing. It's like we have to get out of this. We have to get out of this mode of thinking of things as good or bad.
As we were having this conversation, one of the things that I have become aware of is the ways that we've used rites of passage. And oftentimes when I've seen different people or programs use rites of passage, I'm glad that they're using it. But oftentimes it gets directed towards people who are in trouble or people who are struggling with different things, rather than it not only being things that we teach young people.
It's like all of us need to go through it.
That's the point. That it needs to go to the people who are the teachers or get enlisted in helping in the rites of passage. But it also needs to be directed towards people that are doing well. Or have, let's say, the advantages different than people who don't have those advantages. It shouldn't be directed only at kids that are in trouble. It should be directed towards everyone, and including and particularly the people who are the teachers and the mentors that we, pull together.
In Tanzania, they have this concept of the mwanafunzi, and the mwanafunzi literally means student teacher.
Right.
But it's not like student teachers that we have, like go to educational college and get your ed degree and then you do your student teaching.
Right.
But it's the concept that everyone is a student and everyone is a teacher. Like we all have something to teach. We also all have something to learn. And
that's why I like groups too. From a clinical perspective, the fact that we have groups of people that get together and have conversations about things. Harvey, do you remember years ago in the Twin Cities, we had the men's group that were being.
Where was that? Yeah, that's where you introduced me to Resma.
And so there are a number of people in the community that got together and started having these conversations. And it started with a small number of people, but then it grew. And it started like a couple hours in the morning to that basically, all morning and part of the afternoon. And that was the work, where people needed to get together to talk, but then figure out ways to be able to engage with each other that was not negative. If people had difficulty, they had time to sit with one another and then work that out, even as the group was going on.
Wasn't that at that men's club in St. Paul? I forget what it was called.
Sterling Club?
Sterling? Was that?
I remember it started
a long time ago.
And then in the basement of a church. And then it expanded from there, but I don't know about the club.
I don't remember. Yeah. We're getting old, Al.
Well, sure.
You're be asking us these questions. You see all that gray hair on Oliver's face?
That's right, man. That's right. I noticed that I'm not alone. So.
That's right. There we go. Well, which makes this conversation all the more valuable. I think it's rich that three brothers of a certain age, have a chance to reflect and think back. And so that's kind of what I want to do. I really, first of all, want to thank both of you. I didn't take the time to read your resumes or introduce you, but I want you to do that if you would, because some people might not know. I refer you to you as Dr. Linder and Dr. Williams, and people who just tune in or might read this later want to know what that means. Are you a physician? Are you a musician, a teacher? What is it? So if you would, Dr. Williams and Dr. Linder, take a couple of minutes to describe, what your work is and what your training is, the credentials that you speak from.
I'm one of those doctors where they say, well, I'm not a real doctor, but I play one on TV. But yeah, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I was trained here at the University of Minnesota in clinical psychology, and then I went on to work for almost 30 years for Hennepin County. I worked out at Pilot City Mental Health Center, and then I managed the Family and Children's Mental Health Program for about 10 years, and I worked in developmental disabilities and in child protection, and then back in adult mental health with homeless people. And so I've been around the block a few times. I actually re-encountered Resma when I was leaving the county. Resma was working as the clinical director at African American Family Services. He says, I need to talk to you. And he got me over there to come and supervise a couple of people, because I was retiring from the county at that time. And then after they got me there, he decided he was going to go to Afghanistan for a year. And I said, you're crazy. But so I worked at African American Family Services, and I worked at another place called Pangea, where we did a lot of multicultural work with like Hmong and Korean and Hispanic and African American people. And now I do some work at Metro Social Services over in St. Paul. But I'm also the chair of the board at the Cultural Wellness Center. And I still do some volunteer work with the Association of Black Psychologists. I'm on their ethics committee, and we just use the principles of Ma'at to reformulate the ethical principles for Black psychologists. And myself and another prominent member of our community, Dr. Pearl Barner, were instrumental in that effort. And so that's kind of who I am and what I do. I probably left out a couple of things.
Well, it's a short version. Short. Dr. Williams, you go ahead.
Well, I'm a social worker. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker. And I went to...
what's the difference between those two professions? Licensed psychologist, right? and licensed social
Independent
worker.
clinical.
Yeah.
Yeah, it means that I could do contract work, independently, and but I'm supervised by a set of principles that are similar but different than psychology,
Mhm.
and so I was trained at Michigan State and then Western Michigan, and then I went to Pitt. I got my master's degree in social work at Western Michigan University. Then I went to University of Pittsburgh, where I got a master's degree in public health, but I also got a PhD in social work. And I've been a child welfare worker and a substance abuse counselor and a delinquency worker and a family therapist and an individual therapist and have worked with youth programs and substance abuse programs. I was a director of one, the first culturally specific institute on domestic violence, which was the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American Community. And then I started working with others. From the institute, two other institutes developed, which was Alianza, which was a Latino domestic violence organization, and API Institute, which was focused on Asian Pacific Islanders. But the institute was the first, and I've collaborated with all three, and and then work with other cultural groups as well. Work with Arab communities and African communities and Native American communities on different projects and collaborations as well. And so, uh, as Harvey says, I think I've left out a few things, but generally speaking, that sort of describes me.
Well, in both careers are fascinating, and I want to express gratitude on behalf of community for the leadership and genius that you bring and the healing that you bring to community and society. I'm curious, as a journalist, as a reporter, as you reflect on the career, um, have your expectations of humanity shifted one way or the other? I'm presuming that, like all young people, when we entered our professions, we had some idealism that we wanted to bring in our quest in the world. Does that ring with either of you? And were there learnings that you can look back on now, some X years later, and say, you know, either I'm disappointed or I'm happy, or just I'm noticing? What do you think?
I Go ahead, Harvey.
Well, I expected to have a more distinguished academic career than I ended up having, but there were a lot of reasons for that. I got, involved in other things. But in terms of like my expectations for humanity, my expectations of humanity have actually been expanded and grown because by getting into the Afrocentric study, I realized that um, our history as a people, um, is much broader than the history that we're taught in our
Mhm.
schools, uh, and that for most of human history, um, this planet was populated and ruled by people who look like us. And we have in America we have this focus on the last 400 years. Well,
Mhm.
400 years is just a drop in the bucket in human history. And so I realized that there's a myth in, uh, in African philosophy of a Set, Osiris, or a Set. But this story about Osiris is that he had his brother was jealous of him, of his brilliance, and basically put him in a trick and had his body chopped up and spread throughout the kingdom, i.e., throughout the world, to get rid of him. And uh, and his counterpart, who we've come to know as ISIS, um, uh, went around and gathered up all of the parts and reassembled them and brought them back together. And um, um, because of that, Osiris has this symbol. It becomes a symbol of like regeneration and regrowth and reconnection. And I think that the human body is like that. The body human, all of us.
Mhm.
That's an that that myth is just an allegory of what the human race, the human species, is about. That we started out in one place as one being, and we spread out and went all over the world and developed different cultures and different languages and different visages. Uh, but ultimately, our destiny is to come back together and to be united and to become one people again, as we always were. We just don't recognize that we're all parts of one body. And so the growth that the body human has to do is just one of becoming conscious of itself as one. And
So my question, Dr. Linder, is: are we there yet?
we're not there yet. We're not, we're probably closer than we know.
Hmm.
But no, we're not there yet. And the likelihood is that we probably have a lot more dissemination to go before we get there. We have a lot more of struggling with each other and fighting with each other and killing each other, before we come to the realization of who we are. uh, and realize that, like in that old Pogo cartoon of, we have met the enemy and they are us.
Hmm.
Uh, that's our reality as human beings. It's like we're killing each other because we don't know that we're killing ourselves. And once we come to the once we have that realization in our consciousness, we will stop killing ourselves. That will eventually happen. It will happen. It may not happen in my lifetime. It may not happen in your lifetime, but it will happen.
Now,
Oliver, what do you think?
yeah, for me, I keep thinking that the work continues. That every time I think that there is some idea that we've embraced and it's the way that it is, and we shouldn't even think about it anymore. Then I'm reminded that that there are people who think differently, and as a consequence, the work continues. And there's something about framing issues, that should encourage people to, you know, be a blessing to other people.
Hmm.
But I keep finding out that sometimes people can be a blessing, but sometimes they can also be a problem.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that they are excluding and not willing to deal with the realities of people and their other life. Um, and I don't want to be perceived as a problem for other people. But at the same time, one of the things that I need to do is allow myself to be open to understand the experiences of some groups, so I'm not oppressive. That being said, there are people that can be oppressive to me.
Mhm.
And as a consequence of them being oppressive to me, that's where I have to direct some of my efforts to try to get them to be more enlightened and to not be oppressive and to understand my realities associated with the world and other things. And some people are open to it, some people aren't. And some people that are experiencing issues of oppression, instead of that making them open to other people's oppression, it closes them off. And it's like, no, it's only me. Instead of me too, it's only me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's problematic. It's I like what you said, Harvey, when you were describing the fact that there are some things that can be seen as one dimensional, but you need to be open to understanding that it should expand your understanding about dimensions, and both being open to certain things, but recognizing that something is not the opposite, is not negative. It may be the opposite, and we have to find some way to sort of look at it like a Likert scale. That something is more fluid than that. We have to understand what the balance is, and being able to.
What have your experiences been? You both mentioned working in multicultural environments. You specifically talked about working with Asian Pacific Islanders and with Latino communities and African communities. And as the professionals that you are, what's been your observation about the similarity of working within these distinct cultures that really aren't so distinct? They're just cultures, but they, I think, are mirrors of each other around either language or place, right? And bloodline. What are your observations about that? And the question really is there something common in our experiences that is our relationship with the conquistadors, the Europeans, the colonizers? Is there something that we either know or talk about or do not talk about, but that is the elephant in the room that shows up in our culture, our families, our aspirations, and the challenges we face? Harvey, what do you think?
Something that shows up in the room in Western culture, in white organizations. Like I've worked in like um, predominantly white organizations, and I've worked in some very culturally diverse organizations. And the one thing that I notice consistently is that the diverse organizations don't have diversity committees.
Say that again.
Right.
I said the one thing I noticed consistently is that the most diverse organizations I've worked in don't have diversity committees. They don't need them because they get it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
and the organizations that have diversity committees,
Right.
they talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about
Right.
diversity, and they remain predominantly white.
That's right. What
So
an observation.
just look for yourself and see if you notice the same thing.
Well,
Mhm.
I remember I've had similar experiences, Harvey. I remember going to, and I won't list the name of the organization, but I remember after years they brought me on to work with this organization, and they hadn't done it for like a long time, particularly somebody who was African American.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got there, they had a meeting of all the employees. And I guess it was an effort to be welcoming, but the thing that they said was the fact that they look around the table, and then what they happen to notice is the fact that there's diversity that exists within the organization now. And they thought that was a good thing. But I was looking out, and I was
Like, did I miss
They meant
something?
you.
where is it? And
Mhm.
I had to get a mirror, so I look at myself.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, so I agree with you in terms of, and I think the other thing is the fact that when you have a group of people who come from diverse backgrounds, they understand it without you having to explain it to them in the same way.
Mhm.
It's kind of like you don't have to convince them that your reality is real. They understand it. And then the other thing is that they're maybe willing to take action. To me, the thing that I've been involved in organizations where they said that they wanted to address diversity, but they wanted to only do it in a token fashion rather than dealing with it in a substantive fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's troubling, and that's why I keep saying the work continues.
Mm-hmm.
But the question becomes, if you're there for a period of time and you see that the work continues, the question becomes, how much do you contribute before you get burnt out?
Mm-hmm.
And we can't afford to be burnt out, because we know the significance of it to the people that we want to get served, and we're hoping to serve, by what we try to contribute.
How important is it to bring more people into the training, to the profession?
So the work continues. That's all
that you are in.
Yeah.
How important is that? And the reason I'm asking is that this morning at 6:30, I was on another panel at Black Press USA, the morning show for the National Newspaper Publishers Association, and they had guests who were organizing this initiative to support and make people aware of the need to connect with men and women who are coming out of incarceration. So they're trying to create a national movement in communities. There are projects and programs everywhere, but how do they connect them so that there is more efficiency, efficacy? And so the main part is that this discussion about the trauma, the what's the word for it? The challenges that people have coming out of incarceration back into the community. Difficult to get a job, difficult to get reestablished, difficult to get your bearings sometimes if you have been incarcerated for a year or 2 or 5 or 10 or 20. And they revealed the statistics about the overpopulation of Black people. The mass incarceration was the theme. So the question is, how do we look at that question of mass incarceration? Do we look at that, Harvey, in the context of our entire experience as the next level in the transatlantic slave trade, as the extension from slavery through Reconstruction to a response to the civil rights movement, the need to do something with us, and therefore policies that kept us either in some kind of labor or marginalized position. How do you look at that? And then here's the question. How do we get more Harvey Lenders and Oliver Williams in a pipeline so that we can begin to both analyze, articulate, serve the individuals who are experiencing this need to reconnect with community, but also teach the whole community about our shared responsibility to each other when we have failed each other at one level or another? Do we have a duty, and do we have a capacity? And can we look at that as a business? Can we monetize our health and our healing and be beneficiaries of the work that can be done to help individuals become their best selves? What do you think?
Well, we can. The two problems. One problem is that the majority community doesn't want to.
Right.
They say they want to, but they don't really want to. And that's why they haven't done it.
Because why? Why don't they want to?
Because things work fine for them.
It's good business
they have
for them. That's what I say.
Think about it, like they're successful. They have no motivation to change the system.
Right.
I was reading the website of the program that I got my degree in, many years ago. I got my degree like 40-something years ago. And on their website, they were touting their diversity initiatives and how they're trying to bring in cohorts of diverse students. And in the description, they mentioned that in the history of the department, they had never had an African-American faculty member. I mean, they've had like people who were like community faculty who came in and taught a course or a seminar, but they never had like a full-fledged African-American faculty member. And this was like last year, I was reading this website. So it's like 2021, and you're like one of the major universities in the country and in the world, and you've never had a black faculty member, and 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 you're not outraged by that, uh, and you see yourself as making progress, but you don't see the problem. So it's like, it's like this problem is invisible to people who are not affected by it, and they're never going to change it because they have no motivation to change it. We do have to change it. Uh, the problem we have in trying to make that change is that the people who we educate uh, are so acculturated to the existing system that if you get up to my level or Oliver's level and you got a degree, like most of those people they're not about to change the system. They've become a part of that system. Uh, we could we could start our own universities. We don't. Even if you go around to the HBCUs and look at their boards, it's like their boards are made up of people who don't want those institutions to change. Uh, there's a couple of maybe three, um, maybe four HBCUs around the country that actually have an Afrocentric um, Department of Psychology, an that has an African-centered focus. All the others are chasing Western psychology. So the problem is they're not training more people like me because there's no motivation to. If they wanted to, they could have started doing this 50 years ago. They didn't, and they haven't. They see diversity as what Oliver was describing earlier about the tokenism. Like, we got this one black, we got this one Indian, we got this one, Asian, and so we're diverse, so we're good, and that's kind of where it is right now.
Well, we're out of
They're
time.
not going to change it.
But we will. We
have
to. We're out of time for today. This is a great conversation. Oliver Williams, Dr. Oliver Williams, Dr. Harvey Linder. Thanks to my colleague and co-host. She's not here today, but I see she's monitoring. She says, I'm enjoying hearing wisdom from you gentlemen of a certain age. Not only do they think it's because they believe their oppression is more important and more painful than yours. So we're talking about other people who feel like they can minimize our story. Our story is important. Listen, thank you so much. I'd like to continue the conversation because, the one I'm having is about how do we have the confidence to develop and deliver our training, our intelligence, and our interest into a system or process or set of relationships between us that that validate who we are, our existence, and that put us on a path to what I call, for the culture, self-actualization, for the individuals, self-actualization, and that necessarily means some kind of resistance or solution to the problem that supremacist thought has meant to us. And it's not to be upset at individuals, but to look at and shake and crack and dissolve structures that maintain inequity and barriers to our fulfillment. That's what I want to talk about. And I'm going to ask you guys to come back to go deep on that conversation. Would that be okay?
Perfect for me. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And to start something with it, I think the reason why I have done it has something to do with the fact that when I've heard other people tell their stories, it doesn't include me. And so there's the conversation is not full. And I need to point out what's different about the conversation. What happens is you find that other people add into the story and makes it more rich, but also tells another truth.
Dr. Williams, Dr. Linder, thank you so much. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right.